I'm not sure how the Tunisians have ever forgiven the French for this. Tunisia may be a relatively new nation, but it is an ancient country, with a history going back well over 3,000 years. Unfortunately, that history is studded with repeated invasions and despoliation. From the Phoenicians, to the Romans, to the Vandals, to the Berbers, to the Moors, to the Ottomans, and latterly the Europeans, when the Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité French generously rescued the Tunisians from themselves in 1881. In a sense, therefore, the French were only doing what every other invading army had done. But whereas the Romans had built aqueducts and theatres, the French just robbed the country blind. The other European nations were hardly better, and during World War II, the British and the Germans gleefully smashed up much of North Africa, until, in 1942, after waiting to see which side was winning, as in World War I, the Americans joined in and summarily got their arses kicked at the Battle of the Kasserine, losing 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 missing. After this, the Germans were gradually forced out by the plucky British, and at the end of the war, the newly liberated Tunisians were sent back into serfdom under the heels of their noble colonial masters, the ones who had done so much to free them from the clutches of the evil, evil Nazis during the previous 3 years. During World War II, the Vichy French government was busy persecuting Jews, but now that the Zionists are back in charge, nice people don't talk about that anymore, especially not in front of the Arabs. The Tunisians themselves, along with many other colonial serfs, were not especially happy with this, and although the French outlawed political parties to protect the Arabs from the ravages of democracy, Bourguiba emerged as a nationalist leader who started rousing the Tunisian rabble, and a decade later became the first president when the country finally became independent. The French Empire. As undisputed rulers of the waves since the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, valiant conquering heroes of the Second World War, and sole inventors of the atomic bomb, the French master race decided they rather liked Bizerte and built a nuclear weapons base there. And, having gone to all that effort and expense, they were damned if they were going to hand it over to some band of ragheads who had rather inconsiderately set up their own country right next door to it. So, even after independence in 1956, the French stayed in Bizerte. The Massacre. In 1961, Tunisian forces surrounded and blockaded the naval base in the vain hope of forcing France to abandon its last squat in the country. However, after Tunisia warned against any violations of its airspace, the French defiantly sent in their intrepid air force to bomb some sense into the uppity locals, as an act of rightful self-defense, you understand. And the whole thing kicked off. Tunisian troops responded by firing warning shots, and in an entirely proportionate response, 800 fearlessly ferocious paratroopers were sent in as a show of French imperial virility, before things quickly spiraled into a bloodbath of atrocities against the civilian population. The following day, the French launched a full-scale defensive invasion of the town of Bizerte, using defensive tanks, defensive artillery, and 3 defensive cruisers stationed offshore. The, no doubt extremist, Tunisians' few aggressive artillery posts were destroyed by defensive rockets fired by the defending French planes. France is, of course, righteously entitled to defend itself against uppity indigenous Arabs whose ancestral homelands they have invaded and colonized. Sound familiar? Tanks and paratroopers penetrated into the city from the south, while Marines stormed the harbor from landing craft. Tunisian soldiers, paramilitaries, and hastily organized civilian volunteers engaged the French in heavy street fighting, but were forced back by vastly superior French forces. By the time the fighting had ceased, something like 4,000 Tunisians were dead, most of them civilians. The French lost 24 dead and 100 wounded. UN intervention. Bourguiba appealed to the UN and other international bodies, and diplomatic pressure was applied to the French, following the pattern of humiliation heaped on by their eviction from Indochina, Algeria, and Egypt after the Suez Crisis. Tunisia obtained the support of the UN Security Council on a resolution condemning France, and from then on, it was pretty much game over. French civilians left Bizerte between, but the military base was not finally evacuated until 1963, 7 years after the proclamation of independence. The aftermath. This is the bit I don't understand. There are bullet holes in all the palm trees along the road outside the marina, and yet the Tunisians seem to bear no grudge or resentment towards the French. I like Tunisia, and whisper it, but I quite like France and the French too. But it's not nice to admit that in polite company.